Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm your stylist scientist, Professor Peter Jonason. And I want to come back to the issue of fashion, not just because I'm wearing new pants from a company called Hearse. Maybe it's Hersey, I'm not really sure if I'm honest. But because that's what we talked about last time, and I thought we would move to the science bit now instead of just the style bit. For most people, I think something like clothes or tattoos or beards are seen as just superficial affectations, right? They don't really have any bearing on anything meaningful, and that to be interested in them or to make judgments about people's personality or character by them is somehow superficial and specious, maybe, right? But of course, I don't think that's the case, and I think that's a very cynical way of seeing things like fashion and beards and tattoos. These are all kind of similar ways that we express ourselves, right? We're dealing with self-expression here. For a lot of people and a lot of academics, things like fashion, things like beards, things like tattoos are seen as a little bit unimportant, I guess. They seem, because academics have this superficial appearance, they want to seem like they're doing things of depth, of serious importance, curing diseases and all this kind of stuff. But even if you just scratch the surface a little bit, the most basic kind of descriptive level of psychology would tell you that beards, tattoos, the clothes that we wear are super important, and they are manifestations of things inside of us, right? And so the choices that we make in the world are advertised, and it would be a fool who didn't say, okay, those choices come from somewhere, that they come from inside, and so those choices actually tell you something about the person inside, right? They might tell you about their personality, it might tell you about their value system, a variety of things that we'll talk about today. But if you go a little further, a little deeper into this, you start to think of things like clothes and beards and tattoos as having some potentially evolutionary significance. In the case of all those, you might have intrasexual competition motives, which is about how you compete with members of the same sex, right? So I might wear particular kinds of clothing because I'm trying to say to other men that I'm, for example, more successful, more stylish, etc. But it could also be intersexual selection, right? That I'm using fashion to advertise to the world, to women in particular, for me, that I am a competent man, I am an attractive man, I am a confident man, all kinds of things that I might be trying to signal. And so women will generate kind of naive hypotheses about my character, just as competitor males might, based on the outward expressions. And this idea of outward expressions gets us to what's called the extended phenotype, right? And so we have genes, right? And our genes, our genotype, kind of program us to a fair degree about the kinds of ways in which we display ourselves. So I display myself with two arms, for example, because my genotype allows me to have two arms. I didn't lose an arm also, of course, right? But then when you move a little bit further, you get to what's called the phenotype. And the phenotype is like the loss of an arm, right? So the life experiences I've had can indicate things about me, right? So it's the result of the interaction of my genes and my lifetime of experiences. But we can go one step further to the extended phenotype. And people like Richard Dawkins have had lots to say about this, even people like my colleague Severin Luto, who has also things to say about this. But ultimately, it would suggest that everything we do, in a way, is part of this extended phenotype. It's part of this extended bubble around us. So the way in which I decorate my apartment, the things you see behind me, the pictures of my grandparents, my clothes, my hairstyle, for example, my choice of watch, all of this stuff is in some degree a function of my internal systems that I'm trying to use in a kind of evolutionary way. Yeah? And so what they do then is that the idea is that they signal my clothes, my choice of clothes, my beard, all these things will signal to other people the choices I have made. And so what do those, can we draw conclusions about people's choices based on, so for example, their clothes? And what are those what are those inferences we can make? Now, I'm not going to say they're perfect inferences, right? There's always variability. One of the pet peeves of mine is when I try to explain a finding to a friend of mine or some kind of psychological truth, let's say. It's always like, well, what about me? Or what about my friend? This kind of whataboutism, or this idea that somehow the one exception to a rule discounts the entire rule. No, we have to talk about averages. So one of the things that clothes might advertise are people's values. And forgive me for looking over here, I have a whole list of things that I want to talk to you about. They might advertise our values. Our values like, I value details, right? So I get my clothes tailored, for example. I value, what other things? I might value an elegant lifestyle, right? I might value advertisements of wealth, for example. I might value standing out or fitting in, right? As we talked about last time, most people, men in particular, dress to fit in, not to stand out. So I'm a little bit the opposite. I'm happy to stand out. And so when I go out tonight, I am certain that I'll be one of, if not the best dressed guy in the place. And my friends appreciate it, for sure. They look up to my style, at least the people who I would call my friends, as opposed to maybe the people who are just circling in my orbit. They may also, clothes that say, may also say something about your self-respect, how you see yourself, how you value yourself. Do you pay attention to details, right? Do you spend time on yourself? Like, not just going to the gym, of course, is a way of spending time on yourself, but do you spend time on things like the right clothes and matching? And not necessarily my clothes. These aren't the right clothes for everyone. There are many people whose body types these kinds of clothes wouldn't suit, for example. So I happen to have a body type that this kind of classic menswear look does well. It also says a matter of self-respect to any dates I might have, but it also says that I respect them as well. And so I'm willing to put in the effort to dress well for this occasion, especially in the beginning of a relationship, right? So you kind of loosen the belt, so to speak, as time goes by. But in the very beginning, you try to put your best foot forward. And indeed, if you're with someone who is not doing that, who is just, you can't get them to dress up for the life of them, for example, or it's extremely rare, you might not actually be a particularly compatible pair, because as you know, this is how I dress basically every day. And so I would need a partner who would at least be able to move a little bit in that direction and say, okay, I'm going to dress that way too, and maybe even nicely, give me some compliments for my effort as well. It would say about self-respect and other matters, not just for dates, but also on, say, a job interview. So if you have a nice fitting suit as a man, or a nice fitting maybe suit as well as a woman, it will carry you some way in hiring as well. Because we have to be honest, a lot of selection processes, both in mating and in hiring, are not as objective and rational as we'd like them to believe. A lot of this is about the impression that you create. And so you want to give people the impression that you, not only that you respect yourself, because the inference would be if you respect yourself, you will respect other things, other people, and things like that, right? Of course, the most basic in terms of personality is that they advertise traits. They don't necessarily only advertise good traits, right? It might advertise things like narcissism, for example. It might advertise things like traditionalism. So if I was dressed in kind of the clothes of a Hasidic Jew, then it would say, look, this is a religious person, this is a traditionalistic kind of person, and they are following the path, so to speak, of their traditions. It might advertise things like politics, right? Maybe it has a saying on it, or maybe just the clothes. Think about America and the kinds of clothes that you might expect, quote unquote, rednecks to wear versus, as my grandfather would put it, East Coast wine sipping liberals, people from Connecticut and Massachusetts and places like that. It might advertise not just big traits like, say, things like extroversion, right? Because I'm obviously willing to go out and look this way and be outgoing, but also it might indicate things like how serious of a person this is. So I imagine this way of dressing makes me look serious. Well, other ways of dressing would make me look more approachable, cool, fun, all these kinds of things. Moving further, especially in terms of the evolutionary bit, and this is what I think is most interesting, is that I think your clothes might actually advertise what's called your life history strategy. Now, there's some evidence by Dan Kruger and his team that showed that, for example, men who had logos on their shirts, like the Polo logo or the IZAD logo or something like that, right? If it was small, people inferred that you were interested in long-term relationships, long-term romantic relationships. If it was a big one, then people inferred that you were interested in casual sex. Why? Because one is showy and one is more understated. And the same thing with like having big, bolden, Gucci on your shirt and all these kinds of things. These kinds of logo tees, and I admit, I used to wear these things. I mean, for sure I did, and I never even processed that it could have this kind of implication to the world. Other shirts like the FCUK shirts, right? They're meant to be a little bit like, I'm young and I have an attitude. Oh, you think I said the F word? No, Grandma. Read it again. It's FCUK, not FUZK. And I 100%, I promise you, I had this conversation with Grandma Pauline because she saw FCUK as FUZK. Okay? Clothing can advertise another kind of lower order trait of, as I mentioned earlier, competence. Right? And so the kinds of clothes that we infer competence to would be more sophisticated, more elegant clothing. If you showed up casually, that wouldn't be the impression that you create. Now, that might be who you are, that might be the impression you want to create. So I'm not making a judgment here. I'm just saying clothing tells people more information than you might be willing to admit. And so this is why you really need to decide who you are and what you're going to wear, because people will judge you, for sure, right? Of course, it also can advertise things like your efforts towards, are you seeking mates? Are you avoiding diseases? Various kinds of things. So, for example, a mask would be one of these avoiding diseases. This is part of what's called the fundamental social motives paradigm, right? In that you might wear clothes based on your internal motivations, and those motivations might not be socially constructed motivations, but those motivations might actually be seriously important kind of adaptive problems like avoiding diseases. And so even now, all these years later, just yesterday, I saw a woman wearing a mask on public transportation here in Warsaw. And so she's telling the world that she is either, I have sickness and I'm trying not to give it to other people, or that I'm so afraid. So I don't just necessarily mean fashion like my pants and my shoes or any of that kind of stuff. It can be this, it can be my earring, it could even be the ring I wear. Indeed, here in Warsaw, where people are a little bit more conservative about clothes, people often think that the ring must mean I'm married. This is people by women, and the earring, you can imagine what people think about the earring. Obviously, as I mentioned already about Hasidic Jews, clothing can also advertise group membership. But these groups can be superficial groups, but they can be seriously important groups that might be under the selection of what's called multi-level selection, right? So the idea of multi-level selection, although I'm a little bit dubious about it, suggests that groups operate in an evolutionary game just like individuals. So the composition of a group, how individuals behave, the rules of that group, will influence whether those groups' ideas, norms, customs become common or less common in the population, how much power those groups have, how much mating success those groups have, and various other things. We see here now quite a bit in Warsaw, we see Mormons, with their badge, for example, and they're signaling a group, right? Even their clothes signal that they're Mormons. So if you know what to look for, you know that those are Mormons just by how they're dressed. They don't even have to have the path on. Now, all of these things are, of course, subject to various things like display rules. In more modern, Western, liberal societies, people can express themselves more fully. And so in modern liberal places, it's probable that what people wear is a better reflection of their choices. Indeed, if you're a child, your parents impose all kinds of constraints on your choices of clothes. And so as we gain more freedom, both from our parents and from our society, freedom for self-determination, for example, the correlation between what I'm wearing and what's going on inside of me gets stronger because society isn't dampening it down. And so if I'm a depressed person, for example, maybe I wear black as a kind of manifestation of that depression. So putting display rules aside and putting these traits, this larger system of traits under the microscope, ultimately it's about how we signal our internal qualities, right? So our clothing will signal our internal qualities, and because we're allowed to express ourselves in modern societies, we are more likely to express ourselves more generously in those places. It tells us what we care about. It tells you what your priorities are. It tells you what you value. It tells tells people who you are, and people will make those judgments. So again, I leave you with the advice of, if other people judge you based on your appearance, that includes your beard, your tattoos, all that kind of stuff, then take charge of that and make choices. Those choices are a function of who you are and where you live and who you want other people to think you are. All right? So that's all for now. Like, follow, share, all those kinds of things, and have a good Friday.